Hi, Julie Escher, Recipes for a Sweet Life. In my last video, I did a tutorial on how to make hard meringues, and we made some very simple heart-shaped meringue cookies, which can be eaten alone or sandwiched with jellies to make sandwich cookies. We also made simple tart liners, all out of this hard, crunchy meringue. In this video, I'm going to take that up a level by showing you how to make some really superb and unusual meringue cups. Now, this might be a dessert for two, perfect for Valentine's Day. It's certainly of that size. It's about 3 inches in diameter and about 2.5 inches tall, but you can make these shells in any number of sizes. Now, to make these shells, we're going to be working with the same recipe that we did in my video number 1 on hard meringue, so I'm not going to show you all the ins and outs of that. I'm going to refer to you to the mixing of the meringue then. But before you even want to start mixing the meringue, you want to make sure all your forms that you're going to shape and pipe the meringue around and your pastry bags are ready to go. Because if you don't do that, mix the meringue, come back and get all this set up, your meringue will deflate in that time and it won't allow you to get the nice crisp, sharp lines that you want to get with these little meringue baskets. And just to give you a close-up, to create this little meringue basket, I'm basically using a small cake pan as the form. I'm going to be lining it with parchment paper, piping directly on this, baking it, and then removing this cylinder after it's baked to create a standalone free-form basket, if you will, similar to the one up here, which we'll be filling a bit later. You can use any type of form provided the sides are flat. It's best to use one that doesn't have a seam. I did some of these baskets earlier with a cake round that has a cake ring, rather, that has a seam, and they work, but it's a little harder to get the meringue off, and sometimes you can crack the meringue. Cracking the meringue isn't atypical with this project because you've got a long length of cylinder to move it off of, and the meringue, when it's baked, is rather brittle, but it's really easy to fix if that happens. Nonetheless, start with one that's smooth and straight-sided. It's the best bet. We're going to line that with parchment paper. I already created one of the height that I wanted. I think this is about 2.75 inches tall, but I drew a guideline at 2.5 inches, so I'm only going to be piping the meringue up to the 2.5 inch mark. And I like to cut my parchment paper off the roll so that the parchment paper has a nice little curl to it, rather than using flat parchment paper, because that just makes it a lot more likely to stay on that ring without having to attach it in any way. You can see it fits nicely, but I do often attach it to prevent it from falling off as I pipe, and I only do that with a touch of shortening or butter, paper to paper. I don't stick it onto the ring because that'll make it harder to get the parchment off the ring when you need to slide it all off. I am going to pipe this elevated up on a platform because I'm piping on the sides. I also need something to handle. I don't want to be handling this thing all the time because I might mess up the meringue, so I'll be handling from down here. So this whole piece will ultimately go in the oven. So I'm also going to line this with parchment paper so that when it bakes in the oven on here, it's easy to pop the meringue off of it. If I didn't line this with parchment paper, it wouldn't be. One last thing to fix here. These are going to get in my way when I pipe, this little overhang. I'm going to trim that off so it doesn't hit my hand as I pipe. And then my form is basically all ready to go. I also like to elevate on something like a small cake pan because then I can fit many of them into the oven at once and do multiple rings at a time, as opposed to a cookie sheet where one ring might occupy a whole cookie sheet. That's not very practical. The last element that I want to get ready before we start mixing the meringue is the pastry bag itself. For this particular tight meringue, and again, you could pipe this in any size, I am choosing to use a relatively small, number 22 or number 21 star tip to create that texture. So I've got my bag all ready to go and turned down so that there's no delay time once the meringue is ready. Now I'm going to break. I'm going to refer you back to my earlier video about how to make the meringue, and we'll come back and get this all piped and into the oven. Okay, so I've got a nice stiff meringue. Just the handling of the bag can heat up the meringue. So I like to do this in small batches and refill as needed. So I've got my guideline at 2.5 inches here. And for this particular pattern, again, you could pipe this myriad ways. I'm just pushing to create a bead and then pulling down. And I'm going to go all the way around, and then I'm going to come down a level, and I'm going to be periodically wiping my tip off to clean it up. So push up to create a bead, pull down. Push up to create a bead to pull down. And I'm rotating from here as opposed to moving this piece too much because I'm trying to avoid moving it and disrupting the paper underneath. Just piping up to my guide mark. and rotating as I need to. I also started in the back where the seam is. This is where if the meringue's gonna break, when I unmold it, it's gonna break along where the paper overlaps. So I always start my piping back there because usually the seam where I come around in the back might be less uniform than any piping away from it. So I've chosen my backside to be that seam basically. And you'll notice how much I've elevated this because I'm really piping on the side, and it helps to get a nice front-on view of what I'm doing as opposed to leaning and piping from further up. But if you wanted to pipe with scrolls or just a random pattern on here, if you didn't want it to look so precise, you know, that's fine too. Again, it's more the technique that's important. And you'll notice as I come around to the back, sometimes I can't fit the same size bead quite as nicely. That's why I like to choose a back. Okay, we're going to fill that out. We finished the top row. Now to do the next row, what I do is I come in between so that I don't leave much hole. Because the more solidly structured this is, the less likely it's going to break. So I'm going to pipe right in here and do the same basic thing all the way around. And we're going to continue in this vein until I come all the way down to the very bottom of the container. A little bit of a hole like there is fine. That's not a big deal. Now, if you wanted to get really fancy, you could do kind of an ombre effect where you start light at the top and progress to darker and darker meringues towards the bottom. You just have to mix up different batches, each in a slightly different shade. I try not to touch the paper too much with the tip because there's some possibility of disrupting the paper and the whole thing unraveling, even though I did have it loosely anchored with shortening. Now, as I move down the cylinder, and I'm on my third row, I think I'm going to fit 4 or 5. It gets harder for me to pipe nice and straight down with this centered in the middle of the pan. So you'll see me scooching it towards the edge. It gives me a little more clearance with the end of the tip, you know, to get a longer stroke on it. See here how I'm start to hit the pan before I can give a full stroke. That's why I have to move it towards the edge. It just gives me, that way I can get the same size bead. Otherwise I have to cut it short. This is why it's also nice to have handling room at the top, because at this stage I do have to handle this thing to push it to the side of the pan. You might notice, I'm beginning to notice that my beads are losing some definition as I get towards the bottom. That's because the meringue inside is being handled and warming up a little bit. It's not bad yet. If I lose all definition, then I would switch to some new meringue. Now, depending on the size of the cup you do, of course, and how detailed a pattern you do, how thickly you lay it, you'll get different yields out of this one batch of meringue. For this size cup, which is about 3.5 inches across, I'll have the exact dimensions in the video description. I think I could probably get 2 or 3 cups out of this before the meringue gets really sloppy. This may be my last row. I'm coming pretty close to the edge, and if I put a pretty hefty border on it, I'll be able to fill in all that zone. I'm cleaning the tip when I have an accumulation of meringue on the end where I don't think I'm going to get a clean bead at the top of the stroke. I try not to touch the previous row too much either, because I find that when I do that, it just makes contact with it, but I'm not really getting my tip into it because that tends to mess up the pattern and smudge it, if you will. So I don't think I have enough room to do another stroke in there. I'm going to start laying my border, and I'm going to do that sideways. And for that, it's helpful for me not to have it elevated, but more at ground level. So I'm going to take it off of here and move it down to this level and finish that off. Now, sometimes if my meringue isn't stiff at this point, it's looking pretty stiff still. See how nice that is? I might swap in new meringue. It's looking really good. So I'm going to continue with that bag. The only thing I'm going to do here, see how there are these little tags sticking out here? I do like to knock those down all the way around because they can interfere with the laying of the border straight at the bottom. So I'm kind of pushing them all in or knocking them off before I start piping that last bit. But see how nicely defined it is? I really like the look of this one. And it will hold that shape pretty much perfectly. It might expand a teeny bit when it gets in the oven, but only if you've overheated the oven. So make sure this goes in no hotter than 200. I usually run it at about 185 degrees Fahrenheit for about an hour and a half on a basket of this size. I'm going to start at my back again. Let's see where the paper is seamed, just so I always have the least attractive area in the back. And I'm going to just do the same process, but push sideways, pull back, push sideways, pull back. And I'm going pretty close together to fill the rather large holes I have in between these that bottom row of beads directly above. This is why it's handy also to keep it up on this pan until it goes into the oven, well, as it's also in the oven, because I don't have to handle the center thing at all, the center mold at all at this point. I don't want to move it after this point now that this meringue is down because it's hitting the bottom paper. Okay, beautifully piped meringue basket. This now goes into the oven, dries for an hour and a half at that low temperature I mentioned, and then we're going to take out that mold and the parchment paper and get ready to fill it. Okay, my first batch of meringues is out of the oven. And before I can fill them, like this one up here with berries or whatever you want to fill them with, and I'll give you some ideas a little bit later as to what to fill them with, you do need to let them cool down completely on the form, because if you try to move them off the form while they're still warm, you'll most certainly misshape them, and they might be a tad sticky then. Let them cool down completely, and then you'll be ready to remove the tube and then the parchment. This is a part of the process that's the most difficult. It requires a very delicate hand. It's quite possible you might crack the meringue in the process of doing this because the meringue expands at a certain rate. So does the pan as you bake, and sometimes they don't always expand at the same rate. Sometimes these might even crack in the oven, usually only when the oven's too hot. But don't worry if they do. They usually crack along a nice clean line that's easy to stick back together if it does happen, and conceal almost completely. So I've got this one cooled down. I've got in a little bit of parchment paper for easy handling. And because I didn't stick this pan down with any shortening, I'm able to kind of pull it out. It's getting a little tight towards the bottom. Hopefully I won't crack the meringue getting it the next level. I may have, but it seems pretty good so far. And I'm going to put my glasses on for the next part of the process. Now, the parchment needs to come out. I do see a little crack here and one in the back. So hopefully this will stay together. And even if it does stay together, I may reinforce it with a little royal icing so that it doesn't open up when I ultimately fill it. Now, normally, rather than pulling the paper off in one big chunk, I'm fearful of doing that because in the past when I've done that, I tend to crack and break the meringue. I'm going to unpeel it in pieces and kind of cut away parts of it as I unpeel. So just a little bit at a time rather than yanking it all off. Now, if it's too sticky and it's not coming off pretty easily as this is, and also cutting away the stuff, just helps get it out of the way. But if it's sticking at all, and if your meringue is tacky, once it's cooled down, it shouldn't be. It should be dry to the touch. Stick it back in to dry a little bit longer before you try to force the paper off. I think I'm going to trim just a little bit more off here. Again, the paper just kind of gets in the way of pulling it up, and I don't want to break the meringue. Last piece out. Now, let's see, I noticed a little crack here. It may not be cracked all the way through because I don't see the crack on the inside, and it's hardly noticeable from the outside. And there's a larger crack back here, which I am going to reinforce with a little bit of royal icing from the inside. And that crack in the back where it's biggest is right along the seam where the paper overlapped, and that's kind of typical. So don't freak out about it. It's hardly noticeable. It'll be hardly noticeable by the time I repair it. In fact, it's hardly noticeable now. But it's good to show you what might happen. This doesn't always happen. And reinforcing it's not a bad idea because as I fill it, it'll give the whole basket a little more stability. So I just put a little white royal icing in there of glue consistency along that crack, and I'm going to gently press it into the seam. And then just leave it to be. Now, if you're not going to fill these immediately, then by all means, return these to an airtight container, stored at room temperature, because otherwise they're going to get tacky, particularly under humid conditions. Today it's raining outside. And then when you're ready to use them, they can store that way for up to a week and stay nice and fresh and crisp tasting. Then when you're ready to fill them, just go ahead and pull them out and fill them. I like to fill right before service because anything soft against the hard meringue will tend to soften it over time and dissolve it. This one I filled, half an hour or so ago, and it still looks good. So you can do it up to a half an hour before, but I don't recommend doing it too much further in advance. And never store these in the fridge because the fridge has a high humidity level, and that'll cause the meringue to get soft. So I'm going to go ahead and plate another one of these guys up and give you some ideas for how you might fill it. There are many different ways you can fill these. You could tuck pieces of sponge cake size to fit the interior in there, layer them with cream and berries. You can just put berries inside with a little bit of cream or mousse. In this case, I've got layers of berries and whipped cream inside, and I'm just going to top off with a few little strawberries and raspberries. Nice red color, which I think is perfect for Valentine's Day. And again, just be a little bit wary about overloading it because you don't want your meringue to crack or collapse. Of course, you could decorate this any number of ways. One other idea I showed in my other video was the use of chocolate ribbons and sugared flowers, which might make a nice accent on top of this as well. So get creative in terms of how you decorate them, and also be fearless as you go about eating these. The best thing to do is just slice right in and go for it. The meringue will, of course, break. It's crunchy, so don't expect it not to. It's not going to be a neat cut, but this is for sharing. This is a dessert for two, so have fun with it. Till next video, live sweetly.